All right, I think we're live now. So, hello and welcome to Why Read episode 17. And so today I have my two lovely guests, which are Baron from Your Brain on Books, who is also, I consider the Grimoire Discord father because he created that Discord originally, which I'm now a co owner of, and I'm so honored to be. So, we have Baron and, oh, it looks like Dan just disappeared.
Oh,
we
off
all,
to a good
oh,
start already.
I know. But hopefully Dan will be back and he's going to be part of this episode as well. So that's Dan from Black and Blue Collar Reader, another really fantastic up and coming channel here. And well, Baron's been around for a while though. So I'll go ahead and start with Baron. We always start with the same question on this show, which is why read? And this could be, oh, here we go. Here's Dan again. So starting off with
Yeah, I think I
Baron.
lost internet there for just a second. We've had some storms out here in
Oh
Philadelphia.
no.
I think they messed up some things, but I'm back for the time being.
No worries, no worries. We're so happy to have Dan here, though, from Black and Blue Collar Reader. So I expect this is going to be a really fun discussion. I'm imagining we're going to get into some pretty dark reads in this discussion, considering I know that Baron, I saw your top 10 list. I know it made the top of the list. I know some of what you've gravitated towards, and including a lot of horror books. I should just go ahead and say. And then with Dan, I know that you're into Baker and getting into Malazan right now. Just read Uzumaki, really into some of the dark stuff. So it should be a fun, dark time for a bright, sunny Saturday.
No, we'll keep it lighthearted.
Yeah, we will.
The dark stuff's fun.
It is, yes, absolutely. So starting off with,
I'm not going to keep it lighthearted. It's
fair warning.
We're going to get dark.
All right. But starting off with the why read question, and we'll let Baron, I'll go ahead and answer that question for us, please.
Sure. And before this, I was just teasing Joanna, saying it was kind of a difficult question. So I tried to put a little thought into this overall, and what I realized is my reasons for reading have really changed throughout the years. But it's kind of gone full circle for me. Most of my life, I've read primarily nonfiction. So reading fiction is somewhat of a newer thing. And if I had to think of the crux of why I've always read, it's really just kind of the pursuit of knowledge. I've always been obsessed with history and kind of the human condition, which kind of leads into the horror that you just mentioned before. So early on, I was reading a lot of Carl Jung and a lot of like metaphysics, psychology, anything related to that. Obviously, I've never done it professionally, but I still have a huge interest in it. But what I realized is kind of probably towards my late 20s and then even going to like the quarantine period, which I think all of us had this like huge increase in reading. I really wanted the whole escapist mentality, right? So that's when I really pivoted into reading a lot of fiction. But for me, at one point, that kind of went stale, at least for some of the more basic genre fiction that I was consuming, just like hundreds and hundreds of books. But I came across certain books that really inspired me and really was kind of the marriage between the two ideas of like the escapist, but then also kind of give me that exposure to these ideas and profound concepts and stuff that would challenge me. Like books, say like Blood Meridian, for example, I know you both have read, which, it's one level, it's this compelling, entertaining Western, or maybe not entertaining for everybody. But on the other side, it's, really thought-provoking and will challenge you and will kind of expose you to new ideas. And those are the books I gravitate towards now and get me really excited. And I'm kind of always looking for whatever the next one's going to be. And I can delve into, almost like trying to look for an answer to a question you never really asked, right?
But I love that. That's so cool. An answer to a question you never asked. I'm gonna have to write it down.
I'm not always successful in finding that, but anything, especially the dark stuff that kind of gives me that exposure to ideas through the perspective of the author, right, I think is artistic. And when I find an author really presenting a concept that I've maybe read a dozen times, like I couldn't tell you how many coming of age stories I've read, but seeing their unique perspective on like what that means, I just find it fascinating. I'm always looking for more.
Oh, I love that. Beautiful answer to the question.
I think great it's really... idea, Jimmy.
Wouldn't that be crazy? Oh my goodness. That book.
Woody would make a really good kid, I will say.
Oh, yeah, my goodness. We're definitely going to have to talk about some McCarthy here in a little bit too. But I really love how you answered the question and about like asking a question you didn't even know you had. I think that that's beautifully said. And I think it's also really neat that you come from a nonfiction perspective and then you realize, oh, wow, fiction books can get my brain thinking in that
Hmm.
direction. It can, it could definitely, uh, it could get us to use our critical thinking skills in ways that we maybe didn't realize that we could use them. So I just think that's a really profound way to explore books.
Yep. And
Fantastic. And
there's that
yeah.
emotion in it that you just don't get out of nonfiction, at least for me, my experience so far.
Mm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that. I feel like I went through a long nonfiction phase as well, and it seemed like my brain just kind of wants answers. I don't even know what the questions are necessarily. I just want answers, or I get curious and I fall down rabbit holes. But fiction can do that too, and yet, like you said, it can elicit emotion, and then
Hmm.
you start really getting hooked once that happens.
Yep,
So,
exactly.
yeah,
Hmm.
fantastic. And Dan, why read? What's your answer to that question right now?
There's a whole matrix to the answer of this question. So, if anybody's seen my channel, I do kind of dive a little bit into this and my past. I would say, 7 years ago, I was homeless. I was living in an abandoned house, and I was reading books by candlelight because of a drug addiction. And I wasn't reading because I wanted to read. I was reading because that was my only form of entertainment at the time. Um, and once I got into my recovery and things like that, you start getting all these things back, right? And I have a home, a family, I have a dog, I have a decent job now. And I set goals for those things, and I have them all now. And now I'm stuck. I need to find myself again. I need to
Looks like we froze there.
Yeah,
reading
lost him
was
again.
just
There we
one
go.
of them. That way,
Um,
did I lose? Am I back?
you're back. Yeah, you froze for a second there.
Okay. Yeah, it lost me for a second there. So, within my first 3 years of recovery, my brain started to heal a little bit better, and I could start retaining information that I read. And I read because I escaped for 25 years, and now I needed to find a healthier way to escape. And books provided me with that healthier um, you know thing that I could do to just kind of get out of myself, stop the demons from circling and talking, and just to kind of relax. I picked fishing as well. I was a big fisherman once. In my early recovery, I went hard on buying so many different fishing things. But when you're out there, your brain's still going. You can start thinking about things, and I would say that reading is the only hobby that I have where I am fully immersed, and my brain is not going because my eyes are concentrated, my brain is concentrated on what I'm reading. And I kept reading because I kept finding out it provided me with benefits. Within that 25-year span of using drugs and things, I conditioned my brain for instant gratification. Now I want to be satisfied now, and that conditioning did not go away once I stopped. So when I read books, I read very massive books. So now I am reconditioning my brain to be patient and enjoy the ride. What does the Herald say, right? Journey over destination, right? I am enjoying the ride here, and and now I'm a father. Like, I need patience. So reading helps me develop that patience, And I would say once I have started reading, that is something that I have, I've learned to hone my patience. I've learned to calm down, wait for an answer, let my anger go first, or let whatever go first, and just, lay back and be patient, and things will work out in the end. And that's, a lot of these stories, like especially Malazan books, they are dense, they are doorstops, they are speed bumps, and you have to wait. You have to be patient for these reveals and for these things. And reading has really helped me do that, to be patient in my life. And, also I'm able to escape to a place. And I really like what Baron said about asking those questions, because if you've seen my videos in the beginning, I have nice haircuts and shit like that. But after reading Blood Meridian, I'm letting everything go, man, because it's that book really got me thinking about the type of books that I want to continue to read.
Fascinating answer to that question. And I really love, by the way, that you brought up patience, and that books give you an opportunity to practice patience in your life. Because you really, I think, unlike other activities, I'm sure there are other activities that might be comparable to reading in this sense, but I think reading is something where you take it one page at a time. Sometimes you take it one sentence at a time, especially if you're reading something that's very dense, like Blood Meridian or Malazan. So I think it makes sense that it would be very grounding in that way and give you a point of focus. And I also really like the word patience, by the way, because I was exploring that word quite a bit when I was going through a really difficult time in life at one point. And I was listening, I don't know if either of you listened to the band Tool, but there's a song called The Patient. And I was listening to the lyrics of that song, and it was, I love Tool, but the way that they were, the lyrics were describing the word patient, it was kind of making it ironic, like the patient who's not patient. And I like that it's about waiting. And I thought, oh, wow. Like if you think of patience as just waiting for everything to get better, like I can't be happy till it gets better, then you're going to be probably miserable. Whereas if you reframe patience to be like, I'm going to be with this moment right here, right now. Like it might not be the most ideal thing, but I'm going to just be here and take it a step at a time. And then I think that the word kind of can ground you and take you where you need to go. So I don't know. I just thought that was a really interesting way to bring that into reading the way that you described. Just as a transition from that point, it seems to me that both of you, from what I'm gathering from your answers, it seems to me that both of you are fairly new to reading fiction for fun. Would you say that's accurate? Or did you go through phases when you were younger and this is something you're returning to?
I went through phases when I was younger, at least read all the ones you're supposed to, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and Roald Dahl and all that stuff. But it was never as prevalent in my life as reading nonfiction. So I'd say it is more recent for me, but there's been, periods in my life where it's been scattered through, but it might be a couple books a year rather than 100. Right. So, so definitely more of a recent thing, at least at the, I guess at the rate that I've been consuming fiction. A little bit obsessed.
That's fascinating. It's amazing to like fall in love with reading, as an adult, that can happen. And by the way, I have heard of this book, The Fisherman, but sounds like a really good recommendation for you, Dan, possibly.
Yeah, it might be. I still fish, it's actually, since I've gotten really passionate toward reading, a lot of my fishing has gone to the wayside. I don't even want to go out and fish, but I need to balance those things. But I would say growing up, all the movies that I gravitated toward were fiction, were Beastmaster, Conan, and things like that. So when I finally decided that this was a hobby that I wanted to pick up, I stuck with what I enjoyed. The movies, I actually, surprisingly enough, I've read Harry Potter in active addiction. I don't know how I did it, but I did, and I do remember that first experience, I think I watched the first 3 movies. My aunt, who actually raised me, was an avid reader. She loved like Agatha Christie and Conan Doyle. I know I'm messing that up, but Sherlock Holmes. And she always tried to get me to read. But when I saw the first 3 Harry Potter movies, I was like, yeah, I kind of dig this. I'm like 25 years old, pretty bad habit. And I still was like, let me read this 4th book. And I remember reading it with the Triwizard Tournament and gripping the page so hard that I almost tore it.
Oh my
and I was
goodness.
like, wow, I understand this now. I get this. And, when the rest of the series came out, I read all those books. And I just, I wanted to be entertained. I wanted to lose myself in a story and a world. And, that's what I did when I finally got back into reading now in my 40s. But it was, but now my tastes are changing. I'm starting to review books on I never wrote a GOODREADS review in my life. I started a channel. It's like, man, I should probably get used to this reviewing thing. I should figure out how to do it, what to do. And that's like another challenge for me, starting this channel. And, I was told by another great booktuber, Carlos at StoryTube, like, yeah, you need to basically diversify your bonds. If anybody's a Wu-Tang fan, that means I need to diversify my palette and get out there and try other things. So I started to get into, McCarthy, and I want to try some mysteries and things like that. And I really want to jump into, historical fiction and other things just to get a sense for different writing styles, different stories, and different plot lines, just so I can maybe become a better reviewer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely a lot to be said about reading across genres. I know that, Baron, you read across genres as well. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I think a book's almost like listening to music, right? There's good books and bad books, and you don't need to like lump it into a particular category. I just love to read everything, just in general. I tend to prefer standalone fiction over, say, like big series. Basically, the time investment, I'd like to be exposed to as many things as possible rather than like spend a ton of time in one, which is just kind of my nature with most things. And but yeah, I love to read broadly. Literary fiction, speculative fiction, to me, it's all good. It's all great.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think that it's helpful to read a broad palette too when you're trying to get to know your reading taste. Like I think the advice that was given to you, Dan, because I was in love with reading when I was a kid. And then I went through phases where I went in and out. And when I got really committed again to get back into reading so many years ago, um, I I had at that point gotten rid of every book almost every book I had owned because I knew I wasn't going to read it again and started fresh. And at that point, I didn't buy books for a long time, which is why I have a very minimal shelf right now because I was getting back into reading and I was loving reading, but I didn't want to commit to buying books if my reading taste was going to change, and I knew it would. So I was going to the library, and actually I started reading, honestly, a lot of young adult fantasy because that was mostly what I found on YouTube when I found BookTube. And that was a great place for me to start. That was a great entry point for me. But, I'm kind of glad that I didn't commit to buying a lot of those books because I know that it just probably wouldn't. Not that I have anything against young adult or even middle grade or anything like that. I still enjoy that time to time. But I think like the major point I'm trying to make is sometimes I think it's good to diversify your palette, especially when you're starting out. You don't have to commit to any one genre by any means, but sometimes getting to diversify your palette might help you find what you love all the more or figure out your reading taste a little bit more, which will
Yeah,
also probably change throughout the years.
yeah, and that's kind of a satisfying journey just in itself, trying to like really be able to isolate what you love and be able to recognize it quickly. So, I think that I would say the quality of books that I've been reading has gone up, and I don't know if that's necessarily true from a quality perspective, or now I'm just in tune with what I actually enjoy and can just immediately gravitate towards it.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jack in the Book Stack, fantastic channel, by the way. She always gets me to want to read other genres every time I watch her channel. And I think that's something that I hear a lot about. Like, I know she was saying this in a discussion I was in with her last weekend, that it might be a little more challenging sometimes if you read a lot of genres to feel like you have like a brand on BookTube or something. But I think there are a lot of us out there who enjoy hearing different takes on different genres. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that either. I was going to ask you too about some of the darker stuff now, because I know that when I was looking at your top 10 list the other day, Baron, I saw your number one choice. I don't know if it'd be a spoiler to mention it, but I was noticing there's a lot of like horror on your list, and
Yep.
obviously McCarthy as well. And Dan, even though you are reading a lot of various things right now and even various formats, it seems like you do gravitate towards the darker stuff. So let's talk about the darker stuff. What is the appeal of reading dark stuff? I got asked this in one of my Why Read episodes, but I'd like to hear your answers to this.
Sure. So for me, like I mentioned, I kind of like to see the perspectives of an individual, like through the author. And I think darker fiction or horror specifically really does that well. So personally, I like to see kind of the distortion in our own world rather than a new one. And the best way to kind of experience that is usually through like perhaps a non-virtuous individual. And how the author sees that, because then they're kind of presenting, I don't want to say like the dregs of society, but sometimes like uncomfortable topics that we don't want to discuss. And it's maybe things that we might feel or we might experience, and it's not commonplace to bring up, but you can find it within those pages. And I think it's bold when authors are willing to do that. And I just love it. I think it's great. I know it's not for everybody. It's kind of a niche thing compared to say like adult fantasy. But for me personally, I get a lot of value out of it.
Yes. What about you, Dan?
Yeah, I think I gravitate more to the darker stuff just because, when we look for a character that we relate to, unfortunately, I relate to the darker characters. As I've, presented in my quick life story, I am a flawed individual in more ways than 7. And I gravitate towards somebody who's that is dealing with things in their lives and is trying to make the best out of their situation. And sometimes their actions aren't, can be morally skewed. And I love me a morally questionable character. So, and I feel I relate to them. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to relate to, Nynaeve or anybody in the Wheel of Time. But, I feel I can relate to Glocta, who's definitely, doing some questionable things, but consistently asks himself, why am I doing this? And that's just, I just love that in characters when they are going through things and trying to be a better person, but maybe their situations don't really allow them to be a better person. And of course, shock value. I like some blood and guts. I like, ear necklaces and, things that most people, turn away from. I stare at a lot longer, like Junji Ito, like when you turn a page and all of a sudden you get this body horror. I'm like looking at the lines within it, like this is so cool. And I just get excited, I guess, when I see crazy things like that.
There's almost like an absurdist quality to some of that too. I would say there's an absurdist quality to Blood Meridian, and there's an absurdist quality to Uzumaki. That I don't know. It plays on the psyche, like the dreamlike part of our nature in some ways, that unveils the darkness in our dreams that maybe we wouldn't want to look at, and gets us to look at it and grapple with it. And I think that could be so cool. So I think something along the lines of what both of you are saying. But it is interesting to find, like, I know that I have found myself gravitating towards more dark material this last year, and I find it just an interesting journey. I think there's something, I think, like you were saying, Baron, that you could just really appreciate about an author who's willing to go there. I felt that way even when I was into art, and I'd look at certain art paintings of things that artists would be willing to draw that I would just not have the courage to draw for whatever reason. Like, some part of me would hold back. And like, wow, they went there. Like, there's just something I really admire about that.
Yeah, and sometimes the dark stuff can challenge you, right? It tests your resolve on like what you can handle and tolerate that you perhaps can't in your real life, right? So it mentally puts you there, and sometimes it can be hard or ugly, and you want to flip the page, but it's also that's kind of exciting in its own way. Like what Dan said, the blood and guts. It's like I can't do that in real life. There's no way.
No way.
But I need to be prepared, like you said, in case something does happen. You know, hey, I read this. I'm good. You know, I can save this guy who just got hit by a car because I read it in you know, before they are hanged.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too that both of you, because both of you are obviously very smart people and started getting into fiction or really falling in love with this hobby in your adult years. Because I know, like, when it comes to fantasy specifically, I've seen a lot of videos on where to start when you read fantasy. And usually it's like transition from YA into adult, or there's a recommendation for more younger adult fantasy or cleaner fantasy. And I think some of that is because, of course, the complexity is toned down, so you won't feel overwhelmed, and the length is toned down as well. But obviously that wouldn't have worked. That's not going to work for every reader. Like, some readers can just go in the deep end when they start out on their journey. And I don't know. What do you two think about that? Do you think that that's accurate, or do you think that starting in would you recommend starting in an easier place? What do you think? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Baron. Go ahead.
Well, that was my experience. Like, you know, when I got back into reading, I did a lot of the FOMO stuff, and like I started blowing through Stormlight Archive and more like the more simple fantasy series and everything else, and then kind of worked my way up to things that were more complex. And I think if I just dived in, I might have been discouraged or wouldn't find just a simple enjoyment to where it would have been sustainable. So yeah, my personal opinion is it's nice to work up to those particular things than just get thrown in the deep end.
But you got there pretty fast is what I'm saying. It seems like you got there pretty fast into the deep end.
Well, it was still years, but yeah, I mean, I guess compared to starting when I was really young, yeah, it was quick.
Yeah,
what about you, Dan?
I feel I jumped into the deep end. You know, like I said, you know, when I think I was about 40, and the pandemic started. I jumped on YouTube, and I'm working from home, and I'm seeing BookTube, and you know, I was into fantasy. So when I typed in best fantasy authors, you know, I got Brandon Sanderson and Patrick Rothfuss, and God, why is his name escaping me? Guys, don't get old. The guy who does Wheel of Time. What's his name? Come on, somebody.
Robert Jordan.
Robert Jordan, right? It was in there, but I didn't want to take too much time trying to find it. All right, but so that's what they all told me to read. This is the best fantasy stuff, and I started reading it, and it just wasn't for me. But I probably should have stuck, you know, gone to YA and read a little more of that, because, you know, finally everybody's telling me Joe Abercrombie. I'm like, all right, Joe Abercrombie. And I just blew through everything that he had. This was where I should be. And then I heard, you know, The Prince of Nothing, Baker. But I was warned, you know, do not jump into that without, you know, getting your reading muscles up. And, you know, I thought I got my reading muscles up. I jumped into that, and I was definitely, you know, thrown back by, you know, the words he uses, the prose, his style, the meta, and all that. And I think maybe I jumped into it a little too soon. But, you know, I do believe that, you know, if if you're gonna be able to read something of that nature, that you just got to do it at some point. Go for it. So, you know, that's what I did. And I think it made me a better reader, reading someone like Baker. And now when I do read other things that aren't as dense and you know, the vocabulary isn't so expanded, I felt like it was easier for me to read other works after I experienced somebody like Baker.
Certainly, certainly. Yeah. So what's interesting to me about that is when it comes to Baker. Now, Baron, you read Baker. I think you read it before me, right? You read Baker?
No, just The Darkness That Comes Before. I haven't finished the series.
Oh, okay. Okay. Curious about that. And have you read Abercrombie as well?
All of it. Yeah. Well,
All
no,
of
not
it.
entirely true. I have one book to go.
Ah, I just finished The Wisdom of Crowds this morning, by the way.
Which one? The last one in Age of
That's
Madness?
the last one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Last one. Wisdom of Crowds, which is the last Age of Madness.
Ugh.
So good. But the thing is, okay, so a couple of things about that. When it comes to a lot of those, it seems to be the case with a lot of dark fantasy. I know there's a lot of argument about what grimdark means, and I'm not even going to get into that because it's just like so all over the place right now. But when it comes to a lot of dark fantasy, like Abercrombie specifically, and even Baker specifically, and Malazan to some degree, though, I think I put Malazan in a very different kind of camp from those two authors too. Well, actually, they're all three very different. But at the same time, a lot of these authors, what they're doing is they are subverting a lot of well-known fantasy tropes. So it kind of surprises me when somebody who's fairly new to the genre jumps in with Abercrombie or jumps in with Baker, because I'm like, do you get that they're like kind of mocking these tropes? And even Malazan to a degree is not in the same way, but it's definitely flipping a lot of these like familiar fantasy tropes or fantasy conventions. And it does so for different reasons and in different ways, all three authors. But yeah, I just always find it interesting. Not that you can't enjoy it anyway, and not that you wouldn't be familiar with those tropes anyway. Because like Dan, you were mentioning growing up with certain types of movies. I grew up with like The Never Ending Story, The Princess Bride, Labyrinth, Legend, Back to the Future, you know, The Sword and the Stone. So I was very familiar with a lot of the fantasy tropes just from movies alone. But at the same time, like that just always surprises me. Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, I just love Abercrombie because if you read just the first law, I mean, it feels like he's sticking a middle finger up to all the fantasy tropes. And I mean, there is a certain quest trope, and it's just I'm not going to get into it, but
don't get into it. Don't give away anything.
No, you can see that he is just nope. We're not going to go there. You really thought this was going to happen, and I'm not going to do it. And I love that. I love something new. I loved, you know, A Song of Ice and Fire, and what happens at the end of that first book, and that was just like, yes, this is. There, you know, there are heroes, but they are not like we see in you know, your real life heroes are not what we see in, you know, in the media, in the movies, and songs that are written about. You know, this was real life to me, and tropes just seem to make it so fantastical and unbelievable. I am not an action movie person, because I can sit there and watch an action movie and just like roll my eyes. I'm like, that does not happen in real life. You have to give me something that I believe, and I believe when tropes are subverted, that is more to, you know, it's a fantasy world, but I want it to be as real to my world as possible. And when you subvert tropes, that's what I think reality is, in my opinion.
Yes, I totally understand that. I think it really depends on where the reader's coming from too, because some people, they have a more optimistic, hopeful way of thinking of life. And not to say that if you're like that you can't enjoy darker fantasy. I was watching Chatting with Nuts last night, and they, Jimmy and Murphy were talking about Abercrombie, and he was talking about how, like, you know, Murphy is very much an optimist. but she loves Abercrombie. And she could still, like, it's not her worldview. It's not really how she thinks of things, but she could still appreciate it, just like you could appreciate different kinds of art. So that's definitely the case. Like, you could still appreciate it, even if it doesn't resonate with your way of thinking. But at the same time, I think that it's funny what you're saying, though, too, because I think some people do consider it more realistic in a way, not to have typical heroes or whatever, or having. I think something else, though, that darker fantasy or darker literature in general seems to explore, that has been fascinating to me as somebody who loves heroic fantasy, because I personally, epic fantasy is my favorite. I've always loved heroic fantasy. I love the hopeful stuff. I love Lord of the Rings. But I just find it interesting how reading Baker, reading Blood Meridian, that kind of stuff this last year. Yes, timing is a thing, I would say here. But what's fascinating to me is just how I can actually appreciate reading characters who lack agency and find that whole exploration really interesting. Like the illusion of agency. Because I feel like that's a lot of what these authors are playing with, is that characters who have this illusion of having free will, of having agency, only to find out they don't really have what they think they have.
Yep, which is realistic, right? Which I think Dan was saying before was, that's how we are.
Yeah. And maybe we don't have as much free will as we think.
Yeah.
Maybe?
Yeah. And that kind of illusion of self-awareness, perhaps.
Wow. Yeah. I don't want to be too dark, but maybe there's some truth there. I don't know. Yeah. Do you all think, like, when it comes to, how would you say, actually, maybe I'll flip it this way. How would you say Stephen King approaches that kind of theme, Aaron, since it seems like you've read a lot of King?
I have. Yeah, I mean, he has like the craziest characters, right? And he'll really drill into like, what is I don't even know how to say it. Like, we all know that like crazy guy on the corner, right? And King's like, no, we're just going to make this the focal point of the entire story and try to really like pull them in. And I think that's just really cool. But I think of him, like, he's just more suspense and just such an amazing storyteller overall and immersive. Like, he has this just kind of, I don't know, like just this, like your uncle telling you a story kind of feel to it. And I just get hooked in so quickly. And just the fact he does put these kind of darker, wacky characters in there is really neat. It makes it feel immersive to me.
Yeah. I love his characterization. I haven't read a ton of King. I've just read the Dark Tower series, Salem's Lot, 11/22/63, and Fairy Tale. That's the extent of my King journey so far. But I can say, especially in the Dark Tower series, like some of his character work for me is some of the most realistic. I feel like Eddie Dean, for example, that's a character I feel like I know in real life or something. Have you read the Dark Tower series, by the way, Dan?
No, I have yet to get into King.
Goodness.
So my first experience with Stephen King, I believe my aunt had some of them, but I wasn't the greatest teenager in my time, and back in the day, you got arrested for weed. I think now it's just a ticket, but I got arrested quite a few times in my teens, and I had to do community service, and it was at a thrift shop, and I had to straighten out the thrift shop, and I ran into Cujo. And, they're selling these books for a couple cents and stuff. And I'm like, she told me I could go on a break, on my community service. And I started reading. And the lady was like, you know what? If you read, you don't have to do any work for the rest of the day. And I'll sign off on you. So I started reading King, and I started reading Cujo. And, I was really into the Grateful Dead back then. And there was a Dead song within the book, and I was just like, "Oh man, I got to get into him," but it just never panned out for me. So that's my short King story, and like a very cliche booktuber that I'm gonna be. I'm gonna read King in October, of course, because October's and I'm picking out 3. It's nothing wrong with that. I do say that, but I'm picking out 3. I've settled on the vampire one.
Salem's Lot.
Thank you. I've settled on Salem's Lot, and I don't know, and I don't know. So I'm looking for something that the Baron was saying, a very condensed story, like a kind of shorter. I don't want to jump into it. I have experienced it via television. I hear it's different. I've also, experienced The Shining through television, but I hear the story is different. I want something a little different from King. So I'm definitely on to Salem's Lot for October. And I want to find another book that I feel that I'm going to love from him for that month.
He does have a lot of short stories.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is I have until October to convince you to read it.
You know what? Because of this, I'm going to read it.
It was that easy?
It was that easy. You know what, Baron? Because I love your channel, and I just love how you speak about books. And you sold me on your top 10, your number 1. I already tried to look that up in my library. They don't have that particular one. But yeah, I'm gonna do it. It's gonna be a twofer though. Like, it's that big. So I'm doing Salem's Lot, and I'm doing it.
Yeah, that's smart.
I had 3. I was thinking about, I guess he just switches to genres. I guess Mr. Mercedes is more like a detective type thing. Does he do horror and detective novels?
He does a lot of different genres, honestly, because he does that. 11/22/63 is kind of more sci-fi, I would say.
And the Dark Tower, yes.
The Dark Tower is totally genre bending. I mean, we have it's obvious it's more fantasy than anything, but it has metafiction in it. It has some sci-fi elements in it. It has Western elements in it. But there is a character who struggles with addiction in that particular series. And
which one?
Eddie Dean in the Dark Tower series.
Oh,
one of my favorite characters of all time.
That's an automatic for me sometimes. I want to read Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick. I think there's some drug use in that. I really want to find something with that in it. Obviously, I'm going to connect to it, but
I think that the Dark Tower series, I think it does approach addiction in an interesting way and like in a nuanced way, but also not just addiction of drug, but also just the OCD kind of like obsessive, I need to do this kind of thing sort of journey. But I love his writing in that particular series. My favorite was book 4. I still enjoyed the series overall though, and highly recommend just to get to know Eddie Dean as a character. But he doesn't show up till book 2 in that series. It's the only downside.
Yeah. But the first one you can read in a day, so no problem. And
so maybe that should be your 3rd.
Yep, there you go.
Slinger.
Yeah, okay. I love Dark Tower. Right behind me here. And, that was kind of my series, similar to how you were with Abercrombie, where I started reading. I was like, this is it. This is what I want right here.
Awesome.
Abercrombie's so much fun, though. Goodness, brilliant writer. What a brilliant writer. I just admire his writing so much. Like his humor,
his character work,
his characters. Savine in the last trilogy. Oh. I think she's now my favorite female character of all time. I'm going to really have to think about it. It could be just recency bias, but I'm like thinking, I think Savine is my favorite character of all time. Loved her that much. Yeah, she's great.
And I also just love the audiobooks. I'm obsessed with Pacey. Like, I couldn't imagine actually physically reading those books. It's got to be Pacey.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the thing that... Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
You were talking about Pacey and the audiobooks. It's just another thing that, being a new reader, I really didn't know there were audiobooks, and then all of a sudden, I start running into them. And that takes a particular type of skill to be an audiobooker, I just thought, a lot of people had that feeling, oh, that's not reading, this and that. And, if you get the story, you get the story. But for me, I'm just, I'm working and I want to be reading as I'm working at my job at home. And I'm like, let me just try this audiobook and see if I can do it. And I'm starting to get, used to having a good experience with audiobooks.
Yeah, for me, at least with the First Lost series, I mostly immersion read them, which means that I would read them physically at the same time as I'd listen to them, because I have a really hard time if I'm just listening to avoid mind wandering, because my
Yes.
attention, especially with fantasy, if I'm in a secondary world, I have a really hard time focusing. If I'm reading something that's more grounded in our world, then I don't have as hard a time with audiobooks. It really depends. It really depends on the genre, it depends on the narrator, it depends on several factors for me. But I did appreciate immersion reading because there are certain techniques that Abercrombie does as a writer that I really like to pay attention to in his writing. So I feel like just having the visual thing there is helpful.
Yeah, immersion reading is great. I do primarily audiobooks now, but when I given the chance, I like to do the immersion reading. That's what I did with my experience with Malazan. I did everything immersive, which I think helped a lot.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet.
So tell me about that, Baron. So you read the first 3 books in Malazan and
Mhm.
you kind of dropped off. I remember you weren't really connecting to it as much as
Yeah, no, tons of respect for Erickson. I think he's like, a huge imagination, and the world that's created and the magic, everything else is really fascinating and is unique, outside of the fantasy genre. But for me, it's just not something I really gravitate towards, but I definitely understand why people love it as much as they do.
yeah. Yeah. Was there anything particular about it that just made you feel like oh, you weren't connecting, or it just was like a feeling thing?
Just the writing itself, I think, was difficult for me to connect to. It's very theatrical, and I tend to not like really enjoy that writing style as much as is something that's, I guess, a little more classical in approach.
Ah, interesting. So you prefer it more like realistic
Hmm.
kind of writing and grounding. Okay. That makes
Yep.
sense. There's definitely like a lot of wild magic and there are some like yeah, I think I could see that. Some dramatic, emotional dialogue that happens in the series as well.
Yeah, it felt like reading a play.
Ah, interesting. Interesting. Yeah. I'll have to think about that some more. I can kind of grasp that because for Alan's channel so many years ago, I set up for him a dialogue test challenge where I'd pull specific quotes from different books he's read. And
Hmm.
I gave him, I did this with some other friends here on BookTube and gave him 3 options of 3 different characters it could be from. And he'd have to choose the right character. And then we added up his points at the end. He lost the challenge and had to do a funny video where he styled his hair on camera. It was hilarious. It was one of the funniest videos ever.
I'll have to
But
find that.
but I remember I chose one from Animander Rake that he didn't get, and I think Paran as well. But they were pretty heightened theatrical with declamatory sort of lines, so I can kind of get that a little bit.
Yeah. And it actually, that helped me. At first, people tend to struggle sometimes with Balaz and with Gardens of the Moon. But once I started kind of thinking about it within that perspective, like especially the scene changes, it felt like on stage, like shifting as it would be like in more of a theatrical performance. And that really helped me like ground myself within the story.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I know that Alan talked at one point about the Iliad influence in one of the books and something else Greek, I think, inspired. And I know Erickson confirmed that was the case. So very interesting.
Yeah, that makes a
And
ton of sense. Yep.
yeah, what about you, Dan? What's your journey been like so far reading Malazan?
Malazan, I felt I've said this a few times that because I am such a newer reader, I think Erickson's writing didn't bother me as much as somebody who has, consumed a lot of fantasy, maybe even some YA fantasy, because they weren't used to that grand scale, that 97 POVs, that 32 plot lines going on, the context really not being provided as to what's going on in the Malazan Empire, because I haven't really dealt with a lot of stories that really kind of I don't want to say hold your hand, 'cause, you know, but really take you through the story very easily, and isn't as convoluted as, say, you know, Malazan is. I didn't have that much of a problem with it. I heard people say they DNF'd, you know, Gardens of the Moon, but just keep pushing through. The pieces will fall into place, and I don't have trust issues, so I just kept reading, and those pieces tended to fall into place. Now, listen, I am in my third book, and I don't know. I still don't know what's going on with the deck of cards. You know, there is always the deck of dragons. I'm sorry, there is always something going on in this, and something you can't place your finger on. But I am just so enamored with this man's imagination and the certain things that he does. Yeah, it might be theatrical or the cinematic style of some of these battles and the things that occur. I just, you know, I'm in awe of this story, and I just want to know what happens. And I keep reading and reading, and you know, I hope the pieces fall into place. If they don't, you know, I'll probably forget about it anyway, because there's 97 more things going on that'll take its place, you know. And it is just such an imaginative story. I would suggest anybody read it, but, you know, like we discussed earlier, I would definitely suggest people, you know, read other series and just, you know, provide your trust into this author. I was extremely shocked of how funny this series is. I did not think I would laugh at anything that doesn't use a curse word, and I am belly laughing at some of the things I find in Malazan.
Oh, and, just wait till you get to book 5.
Yeah, and
that was the
Krupp
funniest for me.
Is now one of my favorite characters. You know, yeah, he has a certain aesthetic, a certain speaking style, and a facade. I love that character, and I'm so glad I'm reading him again in Memories of Ice right now. I thoroughly enjoy the story. Yes, I'm confused, but, you know, let's hope you know, those pieces fall into place as I continue to read.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's funny because when I was reading the series, while I was reading it, because I've only read it once all the way through the 10 books, I remember just constantly hearing the advice to go with the flow and don't worry if you don't get everything. And I understood that. And there were times when I was able to just kind of read and let go. And those were definitely the times when I felt like I was in the most flow with the books. And at the same time, there were other times where I just found it impossible not to like wonder what the heck was going on or write notes or try to attend to details. And I still enjoyed that too. Like a lot of times if I'm reading a book, I like to tab or annotate. So I would tab my book as I went along to things that I noticed that stood out to me. And then when I finished the book, I go back over my tabs and like suddenly have new context for the thing I tabbed early on in the book. Like, oh, I see how this came into play way over here. And now I understand this in a new light. So that was really fun for me. I wasn't expecting the series to get it gets so emotional. It got so emotional for me personally. But yeah, I mean, I always tell people like if you didn't love, I know everybody says to read through Memories of Ice, but I always say if you didn't love books 1 and 2, then I probably would just move on. I probably wouldn't worry about it. Just move on. Maybe someday you'll be called to it again. If you loved Gardens of the Moon and didn't love Dead House Gates, keep going. If you loved Dead House Gates, didn't love Gardens of the Moon, keep going. But yeah, if you didn't like either of them or struggled too much, then it's probably not the series for that person.
I need to find the person who loved Gardens of the Moon and didn't love Dead House Gates, because I'd probably have. Really?
Yeah.
Dead House Gates? You didn't love that book?
I found out that I am not so much in the minority as I thought.
Okay.
Because I had a lot of people tell me about this. I talked about this in a recent video that I did about favorite second books in series. I gave Dead House Gates an honorable mention in that particular video because it's not a favorite for me. It wasn't when I read it. But here's the thing. I read the series before I knew anything about it, like at least the first 2 books. There was almost no content on BookTube at the time when I read those 2 books. And
Wow.
so I picked up Gardens of the Moon, not because of BookTube. I picked it up because my husband found a used copy in the bookstore, and he had heard about it on a list online of like top 100 books, top 100 fantasy books. And so he picked it up, and I picked it up, and I said, "Oh, I want to read this." And so he ended up picking up the ebook, because with the ebook you could do the search feature or the X-ray feature with the names. So he decided he'd rather read it on ebook. So I read it physically, and I was very new to adult fantasy at the time. I was coming from reading a lot of, Sanderson and a lot of YA fantasy. And so I loved it. I loved it. Did I understand everything? No, probably not. Probably less than I would even now, but I didn't care because it was the atmosphere, it was the tone, it was the slight quirkiness to some of the characters, the interesting creative magic. All of those things were things that I felt like this is what I've been searching for in fantasy and I have not found yet, because that's not how any modern fantasy reads these days. So
Hmm.
for me, it was filling a void I didn't even know I had in my reading life. And plus the female characters, and I think a lot of female readers will possibly agree with me about Gardens of the Moon. You get some really fantastic female representation, especially for older fantasy with
Definitely.
Tattersail and with
Yes.
Apsalar. So I particularly loved that book to a strange degree. Like I loved it so much, and I still have my old battered copy. It's like all tabbed up. And I got to the very end of the book, and I actually had the feeling like I want to go back to page 1 and reread this. I've
Wow.
never felt that. There was only maybe like one other book that I've ever felt that way with. I can't remember what that was now, but that was a very rare feeling for me. It's a rare feeling for me even now, to feel like I want to go back and start over all over again. Like that's how much I loved Gardens of the Moon. Yes, I know that's a very unpopular answer, and I don't care.
I liked your answer though. You know what?
But
Yep.
Definitely, I love that answer. It is like nothing I have ever read before. I think
yeah,
modern, fantasy really, a lot of it focuses on that magic system, really fleshes it out. This is definitely one that does not do that as much. You
yeah.
really have to read more into it to get more of an idea of, warns and things like that.
Yeah, and I know Dead House Gates is super popular, but here's the thing for me. I liked it. I especially loved the end of Dead House Gates, so I did love that. But the journey through that book, I didn't know anything. I didn't even know there were 10 books in the series, and I didn't know that I would have such a huge change in setting to a different continent with so many new characters. I didn't know that was how the series worked.
Yep.
I didn't know
Very unusual.
anything. I didn't know anything. So just that transportation, and it's a very different, I would say, approach to pacing compared to book 1, which people love that it's a little bit more slowed down. But it just wasn't what I was expecting. So I did struggle when I was reading it. And then when I finished it, I really loved the end, but I felt very conflicted about whether to continue or not. And so I actually took a long break between books 2 and 3, and then I watched A Wonderful Interview with Erickson on my friend Brittany's channel, Books with Brittany, and then I watched, a wonderful video from my friend Andy Smith on it's like postmodernism, Malazan, a postmodern critique on the fantasy genre. And then when I watched that video, I was like, "Oh, that's what he's doing. He's not trying to be like typical fantasy." And when I understood that, that was when I felt prepared to go back into the series and thought, "Okay, now that I understand this is doing something so different, I could open my mind to it." And then it was like smooth sailing from then on out. I loved the entire series. I had a great time. And I think, like, honestly, upon reread, Dead House Gates could possibly be a favorite. But it was just that struggle of not knowing what I was getting into the first time.
Yeah. Wow, Joanna, I like hearing you talk about the series. You're so passionate, and it's rubbing off on me. It's making me question, like, should I be reading this? Should I be
It
doing
has,
this?
doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I think I don't know the answer to that. I know for me though, for a long time I was regretting the fact that I took such a long break between books 2 and 3. But now that I look back on it, I think I made the right choice doing that. I think that because I took some time, what happened to me is that months later after reading Dead House Gates, even though, like I said, I kind of struggled through the journey while reading it, I found I couldn't stop thinking about things that happened in Dead House Gates. Like certain storylines kept coming up in my mind. And then I knew, okay, I'm still thinking about this book. That's probably a sign I need to go back into this series. So I think that
Hmm.
that's also a good tip for people. If you struggled after Dead House Gates like I did, maybe take some time. And if you find yourself still thinking about it later, maybe use that as a sign to continue. But yeah, it's hard. It's easy when you finish the series. It's so easy to be like, "Oh, don't worry about it. Don't feel like you have to know everything. Just go with the flow." It's so easy to say that after you finish the series because you see how everything falls into place,
Hmm.
the bigger components of the series. But when you're reading it, that's I can understand how that's almost impossible to feel that way.
Yep. And I admire, Dan, what you said about trust. I think that's great. Just being able to trust the author and just go with it, and just know it's going to get there eventually. That's a difficult thing. I know for me sometimes, like I want that satisfaction or clarity, and it's nice to just be able to sit back and be along for the ride.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
yeah.
would say the trust is going to extend to like 1 or 2 books. I mean, don't go into. I think I saw in the comments somebody talking about Dresden, and everybody telling them to. It's going to get better. It's going to get better. Like, hey, if you're into 2 books and you're not feeling it, drop it. But if you're in the middle of the story and the first book and you just like, I don't know what the hell's going on, trust the author. Maybe they will surprise you and give you those answers that you so desperately want. But like Joanna said, if you read Malazan 1 and 2 and that ain't your thing, like, drop it. Don't worry about it. And,
Yeah.
don't feel like you're different from other people, or that what am I not getting. Trust me, I get that all the time. I get this, what am I not getting, a lot. But with Wheel of Time, unfortunately I might revisit that series, or Stormlight Archive. I should probably finish Oathbringer. But there's just if the author isn't hitting for you, don't feel like you have to continue, because this is what everybody says. This is an amazing story.
Yeah.
It's about
No,
what
it's
you
not for
want.
everyone. It's not for everyone, for sure. Yeah. And I do think I feel bad about that advice, when people say, "Just keep going, keep going." Yeah. I try to refrain from doing that. It's hard because, like you said, Baron, I'm very passionate about the series, but at the same
Yep.
time, I've always felt conflicted about that. I'm like, I'm always passionate about books, and at the same time, I'm always telling people, "But don't read it because you might not like it." I'm like,
I know
am I
that
a good
feeling. Yep.
Am I a bad booktuber? Because
That's
usually
how
it
I
feels
feel
like
about Baker. I
yeah.
want everybody to read it, but I don't want to tell you to read it and you hate it, because then my heart will break. And
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I find some people that I know through BookTube. It's like, nah, I DNF'd it. I'm just like, no, go back. But it's not for everybody. Authors like Erickson, like Baker, even Abercrombie come with warnings. They're like, you might not be into that. And if you are into it, you're gonna love it. But if you're not, you're gonna DNF it. And,
Yeah.
it's tough to recommend authors like that, but it's what we do, I guess.
Yep. I can relate to that big time. Even my favorite books, I'm always hesitant recommending because a lot of times they're kind of wacky. But
I like
uh, yeah, you don't want to get that disappointment, right, when they're just crushing your favorites. But you got to do it, right?
Mhm. What is Kevin referring to here? Starting
Oh,
Malazan and
because
rereading Malazan.
I stopped reading Malazan and he was not
oh.
thrilled. So
Oh. Yeah,
And
I know he loved it.
Kevin's getting the feeling that we're talking about right now. I believe people have, suggested you read Malazan, and you just stopped and you just like kind of weren't feeling it. And I guess Kevin felt like his heart broke when Baron stopped reading. I guess am I picking that up or no?
Yeah,
Okay,
you betcha.
yeah. I thought I was on the right track there.
Good one, Jimmy. That's ridiculous.
Now I really need to read Century.
He's joking. Century came out in like the 70s.
Oh.
So.
Well, then that's impossible. But Baker was inspired by Blood Meridian, which I think is fascinating.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And does quote Blood Meridian in the third book, in the 1000-Fold Knot. So maybe we could talk a little bit about McCarthy here as a transition. Mm-hmm. How would you all sell reading McCarthy to people? Like, what do you think is the hook with McCarthy? Because I love McCarthy too. I've loved McCarthy so far, but I feel like my reasons might. Well, I don't know. I think I might have different reasons than other people. So I'd be really curious to hear why you two deeply resonate with his writing.
Ooh. Dan, you want to go first? That's a tough one.
Yeah, you know, I've only read 2 of his books, so let me just get my shit out of the way, okay? So, so I did read No Country for Old Men after the movie had come out. And I do remember there not being, you know, any structure to his writing, you know, no periods, commas, or quotations. You know, I felt it kind of difficult at that time. I was not in a good state of mind back then. But then I heard Blood Meridian was a dark book from all you guys on BookTube, and I'm like, I got to get into this, right? And then I started reading, and again, no punctuations, no this, no that, and I'm just like, this guy is an artist that is taking structure and flushing it down the toilet. And I mean, then we look at artists that have done that. I believe like Van Gogh with Impressionist that have started total different, different genres of art and things. And we look at Pollock, and they are artists, though they are not sticking with your plain art of just drawing or painting somebody without any, pizzazz or flair. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed his poetic style. I did like poetry growing up. I took a poetry 101 in college. I probably should have kept going with it. But it was a core course that I just had to complete. And I really liked his style. When I got to a part in Blood Meridian, I think it's the Apache raid. I don't think I've ever read anything better than that. I was just like, wow, this is what people were talking about here. Now it's a little upsetting for me because I've watched BookTube. Everybody and their mother says that McCarthy is amazing. So that's already in here. And that, I guess that kind of, you're reading it. Maybe I would have DNF'd it if I didn't know that he was such an amazing writer. I probably wouldn't have. But because that first scene in Blood Meridian with the judge and what he does, you're just like, dude, I got to find out about this guy. And when I got to that Comanche part, I was like, this is what everybody's talking about. The way, the poetic style, the cinematic flashes of violence and the things that and how it flowed. And I just thought that was exceptional. And of course, the judge was just, I'm still thinking about the judge in my nightmares, dude. Not just in my nightmares, but he's got some good points. The themes, no theme has ever smacked me across my face so hard that I still have a bruise from it, 7 weeks after I finished it. McCarthy's themes were just exceptional, and his writing style was exceptional. And now I've just started 100 pages into The Passenger. And I'm like, where is this guy that was in Blood Meridian? Where's McCarthy? Because it's just totally different. Mm-hmm. His style adjusts and changes. And I just think, that is talent, man. And it's like with Passenger, I'm like, feel like I'm reading a mystery novel at right now, where I am in this book. But with Blood Meridian, I felt like I was reading kind of a poetic journey with these horrible people. But I just, I can't wait to jump into more McCarthy. And like Baron said, in the beginning, Blood Meridian did that to me. Asked the question that, we don't typically ask. That was Blood Meridian for me. The question I think that was posed in that book still is marinating in my brain. I still want to go out there and read it again and maybe find something different, maybe find another question within that book. I just thought his writing was exceptional, and the themes were just, that's something I still think about.
Yeah. Just to answer Fantasy Wash's question right now, I would say no. His prose it does read like poetry in a way, but only because it's not in the typical format that we're used to. So I think that Dan already mentioned the lack of punctuation, lots of run-on sentences. There certainly is a lot of simile, a lot of metaphor, a lot to unpack, but it's more that you could just read a paragraph and just sit with it and like unpack what he's trying to say. That's at least how I interpret it, to be more like poetry in a way.
But he makes the reader provide their own cadence when you read. When you want to breathe, or should I stop here? And, does that sentence? It's just
there's a certain flow to it, though. Yeah, it's fascinating because I somehow find I can adjust to it. Like I can adjust to his run-on sentences. There always seems to be a forward-moving sense of momentum behind it. I was thinking about this a lot because I'm currently reading a book by Janie Wirtz, almost finished with, and her prose also gets you to slow down. She also explores very, very long-winded sentences with a lot of rich description, but it's a very different type of style because the way she writes, she gets you to kind of look back and forth the way she writes, especially with these very long introductory phrases that she seems to love. But with McCarthy, his run-on sentence is like the blah, 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 and the blah, 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 and the blah, 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 and the blah, 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 blah. And I feel like I'm always just moving forward and moving forward and moving forward. And they wrote on, and they wrote on, and they wrote on. And so he has these like recurring motifs that come into play. And so I always feel like I'm just in this flow of movement. But that, and also Blood Meridian, most atmospheric book I have ever read. I will die on that hill. It's dark, it is bleak, but it is the most atmospheric, incredible journey at the same time.
Yep. And that's kind of my appeal to it too, is his like command of language, which I think Dan was alluding to as well, is he can be flexible. I've read almost everything from him. I have like one book to go in the Border trilogy and 2 plays, and that's it. And there's a huge variation amongst his catalog, but nonetheless, he has this just firm command on what he's trying to do to serve the story. And it's kind of evolved over time from like the Faulknerian language and like the heavy Southern Gothic influence all the way up to The Passenger, where it's, I don't want to say completely modern, but it leans into that much more. And his stories are unflinching, right? And there's variation in how he tells stories. And there's a stark contrast from this like beautiful poetic description, which we kind of describe, but also this very dry and almost like trite dialogue that occurs. And he knows how to balance those so effectively. And also his stories can be as dense as I choose. So you can read them very straightforward, like Blood Meridian. You can read as a Western, or you can read it as a retelling of Moby Dick, or you can read it as, kind of this exploration on man's relationship with violence and the biblical allusions that are in there. And there's so much you can just kind of go deeper and deeper and deeper if you choose. And that's pretty consistent amongst all of his books.
Yeah, I love that too. I mean, the only McCarthy I've read so far, I read No Country for Old Men. That was also my starting point. I'll be honest, I wasn't super into that book. I do think it's a good starting point for McCarthy, though, because it reads a lot easier than Blood Meridian. I didn't have any problem reading through it. I just remember not being like, well, I don't know why. I just expected something more. I was left feeling that way. I do want to go back and reread it though, and I never saw the movie. But then all these years later, reading Blood Meridian completely blew my mind. For me, it helped to read just a few pages a day per Jimmy's recommendation, because if I had
Mm-hmm.
tried to read that in one sitting or a few sittings, which I probably wouldn't be able to do anyway, it would have been really hard. I feel like there's just a lot to unpack in his prose. But then
Yes.
All the Pretty Horses, like you said, I think he has a tremendous range in his writing because he can. It's still distinctly McCarthy, but
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, like it's a different, more smooth storytelling approach to storytelling. I don't know. I feel like he can go very dense and very sort of simple and sparse at the same time.
Yep. Yep. And like you can see his influences so clearly, even though it is kind of trademark McCarthy, like the Faulkner and the Melville and even the biblical thing, like you were saying. I forget the terminology for what it is, like repetitive use of and save this, kind of showing what is there and then what is lacking. Um, and he does that over and over again. And
I
it's
thought
that
they
momentum
found
you
that in
mentioned.
like a religious text,
Hmm.
that use of and the way it flowed. So once I read McCarthy, I had to go jump into what everybody was talking about. I see this influence. I see this influence, and that's for me. I feel like I'm left behind because I had not read things like this. So I know the Iliad and the oh my God,
The
what's the word
Odyssey?
for it? Yeah, what's that?
The Odyssey?
The Odyssey. You're right. Yeah, you're on it.
Hmm.
The Odyssey. So I started reading the Odyssey after I read Blood Meridian. I saw that his epigraphs were very similar to the Odyssey, where you kind of get these short things. The
Mm.
judge, um, cantina, this and that. The epigraphs were kind of like their own small, excuse me, their own small chapters within this chapter. And I believe he did that happens in Homer's The Odyssey. When you first start off a chapter, they give you kind of these little epigraphs just like that. I just found that so intriguing.
Yeah. Yeah. I I love his writing so much so far. I feel like there's so much more with it I need to explore. I still haven't read The Road. um, so I have a lot to read ahead of me. But
It's a
yeah,
good
I
one.
mean,
Be prepared to
yeah.
cry.
Oh no. You know, it's really strange when it comes to dystopian books. For some reason, if I hear something's dystopian, for some reason I just have a hard time gravitating towards it. I don't know what it
Hmm.
is in turns off from that. I have no idea. But if for some
It's
reason it's
such
something.
just a setting, but kind of a minimal part of the story. I wouldn't say that that is what matters in it. And these
Yeah.
very, in typical McCarthy fashion, doesn't provide a lot of information on why that is.
Yeah. Well, it's
Yeah,
interesting
but
because
I
I am a very much a settings type of reader. I love a good setting. And that was something that also stuck with me in Blood Meridian specifically. And actually, any book I've read by him so far is that he can describe setting unlike any other author I've ever read. Because usually, if I've read a lot of desert settings in books before, but he can give you a desert setting that is constantly showing variation every page, and I don't know how he does it, but I feel like he gets the desert, like, he gets it. Whereas most authors will be like, "There were some dunes of sand and a
Hmm.
cactus." Like, he will actually go into so much other detail, so much other rich description. Just
It's
love it.
beautiful.
Beautiful, yes. Beautiful and accurate. I feel like I'm there because 'cause I'm from the Southwest, so I actually know the desert pretty
Ah,
well.
that's right. Yes.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I'm from the areas he writes about. So that's another reason it strikes such a personal note for me.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've heard the road is very focused more on the relationship between the father and the son rather than the. I'm sure there's great descriptions, but rather than what occurred in this world to that we have come to this dystopian lifestyle. I've heard a lot of good things about the road, and I
yeah.
bought all three. I literally bought Blood Meridian again because I scribbled on my copy like a caffeinated 3-year-old scribbles on a Denny's placemat. I wrote all over my copy of Blood Meridian. It is torn apart. And I'm like, I need this for aesthetic purposes, and this looks like shit. So I bought, Blood Meridian, The Road, and No Country for Old Men. I got them just so I could have it on my shelf to look good.
That was so funny. Denny's place. Yeah, it's interesting too. Like, so I'm also interested in getting into some of his influences, like that you were mentioning, Baron, so Moby Dick. You said Faulkner as well. Is that right?
Yep. Like reading As I Lay Dying or any of the classic Faulkner ones. Absalom is a good place to get a grip on. Well, more his early works, like his first 4 books, are very, very similar to Faulkner.
Yeah, and it's also just fascinating to see how he's influenced our genre or influenced fantasy. So, like we were talking about Baker, he's influenced Baker, obviously, even though Baker, you wouldn't know because their writing styles are very different from one another. But also Abercrombie. I know when I was reading Blood Meridian, I got to a certain chapter and I was like, this is just like Red Country.
Yeah.
And so it was really, really obvious to me how Abercrombie drew a lot of inspiration from that book.
Oh yeah, he loves Westerns, which is, I definitely see that influence spill out. Not just Red Country, but just the way that he does characters and dialogue too is similar to a lot of big Westerns.
Yep. I could definitely see that. We got a question here about, do you guys read multiple books at one time?
Yep. Yeah, I usually do. Normally 2 or 3 at a time. One of which is normally a reread, and I'm not always consistent with it. Like I'll just pick up books that I love and just read a chapter, just kind of for no reason, just because I want to be like back in it or back in the language of whatever case may be. I'm actually reading my favorite book right now, which I haven't in like a couple years after making that video of the list. And I was like, oh, I need to get back into it. And I've read like the first 20% or so far and enjoying it while also reading a couple new things.
Yeah, so when I started 4 years ago to really get it back into reading, I read one at a time. Now that's not the case. I have like 4 going at a time at this moment. I think I'm reading the Passenger, Memories of Ice. What was the other one? Fool's Hope by Mike Shackle. And, it all depends on where my mood swings that day, unfortunately, because I really want to get through these books. But, unfortunately, I think I still have that kind of addict brain where I'm just like, what's next? And I would like, I want to pick this up. I want to pick that up. And why don't I read the first chapter of this when I'm fully immersed in the one that I'm reading, an hour ago. But I'll read about 4 at a time. And, hopefully I'll get through one of those within this month.
Yeah, I've tried to get more into reading multiple books at once, but it's still a challenge for me. I still feel like I neglect something when I do it. But at the same time, it could also be really gratifying when you start finishing a lot of books at a similar time, I suppose.
Yep, and you got some hard ones going, Dan. You got to put some Goosebumps in there or something just to have a little break.
You're right. Unfortunately, like I did a video where I showed people all the things that I've read in the last 4 years when I picked up, reading, and the average page count is like 800, and I'm just like, I need something that is easy. I need a novella in my life, but I'll throw like Pratchett in there every now and again, just kind of as a palate cleanser with the dark stuff that I read.
Yeah, palate cleansers are always good. By the way, so what would you two consider a palate cleanser, considering you're both into horror and dark books?
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I usually just keep going with what I like than trying to squeeze palate cleansers in there. If anything, palate cleansers will be like multi-part stories Like I recently read Blackwater, which was 6 individual volumes. So I would just squeeze one in between other books. And that was my palate cleanser, but I wouldn't say they were necessarily like lighthearted or, like Pratchett or how a lot of people use like Dresden Files or something like that to kind of break up these bigger books.
Yeah, I don't really do lighthearted. I've only read 2 Pratchett books. I do have Small Gods in the Wings. I guess I don't believe in palate cleansers. I'm a dark dude. I'm a dark guy. I like my dark stuff, and a lot of the dark stuff I read is funny. Malazan, Abercrombie. I get my laughs, I get my chuckles, but I guess I'm starting into manga now as like a palate cleanser because it's very quick. Because I have been reading some speed bumps, and it's good to just finish a story or at least finish a volume and feel that that you've completed something. So now I reached out to a booktuber that I really liked, and he suggested this manga, and now I'm really kind of getting into that. But those things ain't cheap, man.
That's why I use library for manga.
Yeah, I have to. If they didn't have the series in it, I really need to find something. I think I have an app on my phone that will give me Berserk.
Oh wow!
I really wanted to try something that hasn't been reviewed by a lot of people. That maybe I can get out there to somebody and introduce them to something a little bit different. So I jumped into this right here, Doro Hedoro, and it's fascinating. It's dark. The art's wonderful. It's funny, and it's they're very short. They're your typical manga, and it's satisfying to actually be able to finish a volume and feel like you've completed something, and not feel like, damn, I need to get home because I've only read 1 book this month, and yes, it is 2,306 pages, and I'm only this far into it. I want to feel that completion, and a manga will give me that.
Yeah, absolutely. Series here is mentioning Robert E. Howard. I did read a couple of those short stories last year and highly recommend them, especially if you're into darker themes or something a little different. Have either of you read any Conan?
I have not personally. I know, Dan, you mentioned some of the movies and stuff, right? You were into it? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely, Arnold. Yeah, I was.
Oh my gosh.
A fan of him.
I highly recommend actually reading though the Howard, and I think you can actually they exist in comic format as well, I think. But you can pick up a short story collection of Howard's, and they read super fast, and also like they're still rich in theme and still rich in description and setting and character work. I actually was really surprised how much that Robert E. Howard packs into a few pages. I think he's a very impressive author as far as that's concerned. I recently did a discussion on my channel on pacing with some friends, and we were talking about our preference for books that are a little bit slower paced. But if you're into faster paced, I would highly recommend checking out Conan stories. That's a great
I'll have to do that, especially if they're short, like they're saying.
They're short, kind of,
yeah.
Scratch that heroic itch, right?
Yeah. I'm doing Michael Moorcock for that, actually.
Oh yes, I was gonna talk about him too. Yes. Yeah. Have you read any Ulrich?
So there are some audiobooks online, and I definitely jumped into it. And a lot of people have overused this terminology, but I love it. And he's definitely metal. And it's like old school. It's really old school fantasy, though. I haven't read any old school, that many old school fantasy stories. But, you have your quest to go save whoever, a princess or do whatever. And you run into these, crazy monsters and magic. And, when I was into this story, I really liked it. I liked Elric as a character, an albino bookworm with a pretty cool black helm and a dope sword, And it was very gratifying to just, jump into a quick and easy story, get the fantastical, the epic out of it really quickly, because I believe there are a bunch of different stories within this whole Elric saga. And it was just, it was fun. I really enjoyed it.
This makes me so happy. I get so happy anytime anybody says anything positive about Elric, because I always hear so many criticisms about his stories these days, because they are a bit more, through a modern lens, they are disjointed. But that's partly because of how they were published on trend at the time. Same thing with the Howard stories. Like, they're not, there is sort of an order, but there's not at the same time. But I grew up with the Elric saga. I read a bind up, I have it there on my shelf, of the Elric stories when I was a teenager. And it was some of the first fantasy I ever read. And so I think I have a soft spot for it. As far as like the metal thing, I think that's true. I would say like 80s metal. That's how it reminds me of for some reason. But I love Elric because, one, if you like looking at where influences come from again, because we were talking about that with McCarthy, it's just amazing to see like how Dragnipper has paved the path for so many sentient swords in fantasy, and also just like the albino theme, like his need for drugs and everything. He reminds me so much of, well, he's obviously inspired Geralt of Rivia from the Witcher series. That's been a big one, but so many things in fantasy. And I think like you said about the plot, like it's a typical kind of quest trope. A lot of his plots, I would say, are not that impressive, or probably not going to be impressive for the plot-driven reader. But if you want just some crazy, wild magic and imagination in your stories, and some really good existentialist / nihilistic themes and multiverse, he's the one who I think is originally coined for starting multiverse in his stories, or who coined the term multiverse. Then I highly recommend checking out Elric.
Well, I knew nothing you just described. I didn't know much about Elric. That does sound fascinating. I do want to try it just because I want an excuse to buy those nice editions that everybody's been picking up recently.
That green one, I love that green. I want to finish all those stories so I can buy just that green book. I think that they just put out. I think it's gorgeous.
Yep.
I was so kindly gifted them by Evie from She Was Only Evie, who was here in the chat earlier. It was so sweet of her. And I feel so bad because I've dropped off. She's finished the second volume and I've only finished the first story in the second volume. And that's kind of my struggle when it comes to quote unquote palate cleansers, is I never feel like I have time to fit in palate cleansers because I'm always committed to so many other reads. But I do intend to continue. I do really love what Moorcock offered to the fantasy genre. I also recommend reading his essay. It's not, I don't know. I have some mixed feelings about the essay because I know for me personally, it wasn't necessarily the easiest essay to get through because he was referencing so many books I hadn't read. But Moorcock did write an essay called Epic Pooh, and that's Pooh as in Winnie the Pooh, Pooh. And so he's basically kind of critiquing the fantasy genre at the time, the Tolkien-inspired fantasy genre, and explaining why he was wanting to do something different. I highly recommend checking out that essay still, though, because I think it just brings some more context to what he was doing with the Elric saga. But yeah, I will always praise Elric. I think it's just so imaginative. It's so fun.
Wow. Yeah. Do you think a lot of what's in there holds true to modern fantasy now?
I don't think a lot of modern fantasy readers will like Elric as much because of, like I said, the plots are a little conventional. They're not really that exciting. Okay. And the chronology of stories, there is, like I said, some sort of chronology, but they're disjointed. So you can see where the stories don't overlap perfectly. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of male gaze. Elric was a Chad. I'll just say it. He was cool too. He was a very interesting character, but there's a lot of, not so nuanced female character work, I guess you could say. I still love them though for what they were, and I just look at them as that's a product of the time they were written. Not to say there wasn't other fantasy that did it better as far as that's concerned, but yeah, I think that some things I can understand why they'd fall short for a modern fantasy reader, but I still love them for what they were.
Yeah, I thought they had a nice dark tone to them, and I thought, if I like dark fantasy, I should check out those who have paved the way. And everybody says Black Company, and I believe I'm not sure exactly when the first Black. I thought it was the '80s, but Elric came out late '70s. And I didn't think people, I don't know. I don't think people were doing that dark, style, the blood, the guts, the anti-hero type things. And I just I thought I should give it a shot. Like, I like Led Zeppelin. I grew up like Led Zeppelin, but I got to go check out like who inspired them, like Robert Johnson, or all those blues artists that came before Led Zeppelin that inspired them to do, make masterpieces such as their first 3 albums. But and I love Joe Abercrombie, and I think it's my duty to go look into what inspired these authors, and that's really why I read McCarthy, because I loved Baker so much. And I feel, we should all look into those things back then. Yes, everybody says read Lord of the Rings. But, there are other people that gave, gave the genre its own flavor, its own taste. And I can't wait to jump into more, of those authors, just to see, what inspired the authors that I love today.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot there. I think it's kind of fun just to be able to appreciate seeing those through lines. But I think as far as like dark story is concerned, I'm no expert, but I want to say that it's been around probably longer than we'd ever suspect. I mean, even just thinking like with some of the sagas, for example, I read one of the sagas last year, a couple of years ago, the Volsungs saga. I'm saying that wrong, probably. And I was just surprised, like how much blood, guts, and gore and betrayal there was in that. So, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint who started that. And of course, the Conan stories are pretty dark. I would consider that dark fantasy.
I mean,
I think
Hansel and Gretel's pretty damn dark too. I mean, this witch about eating children. I'm sure some of these Russian-inspired fairy tales, are pretty damn dark, and there's definitely a a history there with darker fantasy and things.
Oh, that's definitely true. One of my other passions has been for a long time opera, and there's a lot of really dark opera that you'd be pretty surprised about some of the content in. Yeah, so I think that it's interesting. I mean, I think it's hard to point to any sort of starting point for some of these things, but there are certainly influences, and it's always fascinating to see that kind of thing happen. Yeah, some interesting things here in the chat. There's a book out there. Books are made out of books that discusses McCarthy's influences. I really want to get to.
Ooh, I need that.
I think that was a phrase of his, actually, in one of his interviews.
Is it McCarthy's phrase? Books are made out of books?
Books. And Blood Meridian is, a derivative story from, real life events that have been historically not documented that we would all see, but in papers. The judge and the Glanton gang are all, nonfiction. They're true to life people. And from what I've seen, what I've researched on McCarthy, that a lot of his writing is derivative from some other form of book or media.
Yeah, I think that Blood Meridian could almost be considered historical fiction in some ways.
Yeah,
oh yeah,
or some of his
absolutely.
books could.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, scalping was a thing too, so that's definitely historically accurate.
No, it is historically accurate, unfortunately. And I saw your review on it, Dan, and you're talking about, kind of the scar on history that it is, and it's very true.
Yeah, it's, and it's not really talked about. It seems to be a thing that is swept under the rug. You know, like, you know, when we talk about, you know, the Holocaust, that there are movies and papers and all these things that are out there for us to witness what occurred in history. But I just didn't think that there were that many things, you know, regarding our colonization of the states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because Lonesome Dove is somewhat the same story, and that came out the same year as Blood Meridian. So there was a big shift in that perspective the same year, which I find interesting.
That came out the same year, the book or the movie? Or
the book? Yeah, Blood Meridian and Lonesome Dove came out at the same time.
So like,
whoa, I did not know that. That is going to be a priority read for me next year.
Why wait so long?
Yeah.
Isn't it a chunker though? Isn't Lonesome Dove like massive?
It's a chunker because I made a decision at the end of last year that two huge, like, I don't know if it would be historical fiction. Would Lonesome Dove be considered historical fiction? I guess it kind of would be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
I said, so I decided last year that two massive historical fiction tomes I needed to get to were Shogun by James Clavell and Lonesome Dove. So my idea was Shogun in 2023, Lonesome Dove in 2024. And I already read Shogun at the beginning of the year.
I was just about to say that. You read Shogun this year. Like, maybe you should read it. It's your largest book that you've ever read, right?
I think so, yeah, because I looked up the word count. It's even longer than Toll the Hounds, so it's pretty long.
Wow, I didn't realize that. Did you like it?
Long. Okay, I had some mixed feelings about the middle of the book, but here's the thing: like the way that the book is, when I should have been really careful about this. So when I heard people gushing about the book, my parents included, my parents read it in the 70s. Every time they would gush about the book, they would talk about the culture and the journey that this main character goes on to learn from a culture that is not his own, and the way that you really feel like you're in Japan at that time. So that was really the appeal for me. That was the selling point for me. And what I would say is that if you go into the book, go into it for that. Let that be your main focus. The challenge I had is that the book focuses on a whole sort of political plot, which is important. I wouldn't say that that it should be edited out by any means. I just know that when we were heavily focused on the politics, the political plot part of it, I just was not as invested in that part. Like, I just didn't find myself as crazy about it. But the funny thing is, the end of the book was perfect. Like, the end of the book couldn't have been more perfect, more of what I wanted. It brought together that central theme that I was telling you about, like a person who has changed from a culture which is not his own. And so it felt like the whole book, the main point was that. But we did focus a lot on this political plot that I was just really struggling to feel invested in. But it still plays a role in everything too. So it's kind of complicated. So I would say the reading experience was varied, but the end just was magnificent. One of the best endings I've ever read of the book.
So you recommend it?
Depending on what you're going for, yeah.
Okay. All right. I got you.
But there are a lot of considerations. So for one thing, it is an omniscient perspective, omniscient third person. So you are head hopping quite a bit. And it's not like a typical omniscient narrator where you have like the italics where the person's thinking. None of the thoughts are italicized for some reason. And it's not like a couple of paragraphs where you're in one person's head and then you're in another person's head. It's almost like all over the place. Like one paragraph you're in this person's head, this paragraph you're in this person's head, this paragraph. So it's a lot to keep track of. It's not hard to keep track of, but I can understand that not appealing to certain readers. I think again that was part of a trend at the time it was written. But I do think
love
it
that
succeeds.
perspective.
Yeah. But it's funny because I know somebody else, Andrew from Andrew's Wizardry Reads, if he doesn't mind me calling him out. I know he was reading the book at the same time, and it turned out he was really invested in the plot, the parts that the political plot that I wasn't personally as into. which is weird because I consider myself somebody who loves political fantasy as a huge A Song of Ice and Fire fan, but I just couldn't get invested in that for some reason. He did not like the ending. So if that tells you anything, I loved the ending. I thought it was poetic. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was heartwarming. It was everything I could want in an ending. So for me, it worked. It was a little bit open, but I like that too.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, Andrew and I typically clash on taste with like everything, so I'm gonna go ahead and trust you on that one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's hard. It's interesting though because it's dealing with feudal Japan, and it's going into a lot of interesting themes regarding like the differences in culture with sex specifically. A lot of talk about sex. Now you don't have you do have fade to black when sex is actually happening, but there's a lot of talk about sex and the difference in perspectives on sex between Japanese and American, or not American, sorry, British. And then also there's a lot of talk about differences, perspectives on death. So it's interesting to see like sex and death, how that's explored, as well as honor. So it's a beautiful book as far as like illustrating these different ways that we could look at perspectives and how the author approached it. You don't feel like, I didn't feel like the author was in his way taking a side, like saying the Japanese perspective was superior to the British perspective or vice versa. You just kind of get different perspectives and you see characters learn from one another. And I thought that was beautifully handled in that regard.
Definitely on the list. I will get to it.
Well, I have to get to Lonesome Dove, though. I'm actually pretty convinced I will love Lonesome Dove even more, just given every praise I've heard, yours included. So,
I know it's a big book, but it doesn't read like a big book.
really.
No, you get through it pretty quick. It reads like a Stephen King novel. Those are big, but you read them quick.
Yeah. Yeah. I need to get back into King, too. I kind of fell out of my flow with King after a while, but I do want to read it. I still haven't read that yet, but I will get to that at some point, too. I think that might be my next King, if not the Talisman, because I own the Talisman and I still haven't gotten to it.
Ooh, now that's one with some mixed reviews, so I'll be
I
curious to
know.
see what you think.
I know. My brother gave it to me because he loved it. But then since then, I've heard so many people not love it. It makes me nervous.
Oh, we'll see.
But I come from a family of King fans, actually. I probably read less King than everyone else in my family. Like both my brothers have read tons and tons of King. Both my parents have read tons and tons of King. My sister, maybe she's read a little less than I have, but she's read some King. But all of us have read different King books, which is fascinating. So talking with them is fun. I once asked them what their favorite King books were, and it was all over the place because all of them have read such different King books. So.
Yeah, he just has so many. It was earlier you mentioned like, oh, I haven't read a lot of King, and you named like 12 books. I was like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I've read 12 books.
He's got like 90 out there now, right?
Yeah.
And then there are like short stories he has as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember like when I was younger, my brother should be on book 2 because he can explain stories so well. And I remember him telling me about The Long Walk when he was reading it. And he got me so sold on this premise of these boys who were on this walk and they can't stop, otherwise they die, something like that. And it sounded so fascinating. So I don't know. I know there's a lot of King to get to, but
yeah, Theo just finished that one, The Long Walk.
Yeah, he did, didn't he?
Premise of that, I was enthralled. I was.
It sounds amazing.
Sounds great.
It's good.
Yes.
I gotta look that up. I really want to get into King. I've heard so many good things. There's a lot of channels out there that are just, started because of their love for Stephen King. And, I can't wait. October's in the books, but I want to try that Long Walk too. That just sounds so interesting.
Yep, it's really short too.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm the worst when it comes to short stories. I have so many short story collections and I just like, man, I don't know. I just get so, I'm so nailed down right now with a lot of read-alongs and buddy reads and things like that. So I need to just get through my TBR for right now, including Aspect Emperor, which I'm hoping to start this fall. And I'm reading the Jenny Wirtz's Wars of Light and Shadow series, which is an 11-book series. It's very long.
Wow.
So I'm barely like finishing the second book, and I've been reading it forever. So there's been a lot. For some reason, I'm just going slow this year, slower than usual probably, but enjoying everything I'm reading and excited though. I'm excited to get to all of those books for sure.
Yeah, I hear people in comments on lives like, "Hey, I'm about to start a BookTube channel. You got any advice for me?" I keep
Be
saying,
careful about the buddy read along.
"Yeah,
Even though they're the
don't
best
jump
friend.
into too many buddy reads, bro. You're gonna blow your head up because
But
I
do
did that
them, do
too."
them. Just be careful that you're spreading them out the right way. Yes, but do
Yeah,
them
it's
because they're
tempting.
wonderful. I
We
think that they're
start, at
wonderful.
least for me, I start meeting new people, and I have bookish friends now. That, I consider people these friends that I meet on Discord and through BookTube. And I don't know why. Every time I'm like, "Oh, you guys want to buddy read that together?" I'm typing back to them. I'm like, "Oh, maybe that's not a good idea." Like I got Baker buddy reading coming up in August. I'm doing Sun Eater buddy reading with another booktuber right now. And then I got into the readathon for the month of April, and that just messed up my whole TBR, and I had to put books down and pick them up. Yeah, if you start a BookTube channel, chill.
Chill out. Yes.
You'll get to some buddy reads. Only one a month. That's it.
Yeah, I think that that's really wise advice. Very, very wise advice. I also learned that for me personally, readathons are just not my thing. I did that once before I started a channel, once while I had a channel, and they do get you to read a lot of books, that's for sure. But for me, more does not necessarily equal better experience at one time. I just have to go at my own pace, and I'm happier that way. So, um, yeah, I think that that's all really good advice. And hold on a second, my earbud just fell out. Okay, go ahead and say something so I could hear something.
Something.
Thank you. Okay,
You
they're
got it?
working.
Okay.
They're working. Yes. But yes, Aspect Emperor. I'm going to start the Lions of Alrazon this month, which is my first GGK or Guy Gavriel K novel. And trying to finish a historical fiction book I've been working on for a long time. Let's see what else is in the cards here. I think those are the major ones that play. Oh, Long Price Quartet. That's another one I really, really want to get back to. But I was just proud to finish off the first Law books because that was a huge priority for the year too. And so good. So, so good. Man, probably going to be in a book hangover from that for a minute.
I can imagine. I'm looking forward to finishing. I think that's the only thing I actually have that is open that I need to close out. I mood read 100%, so I couldn't tell you what I'm going to read tomorrow. It's
really?
completely
Oh, wow.
random. Yeah, I don't do TBRs.
No TBRs.
I used to.
So, yeah.
But I was bad with them. And then I did kind of what you all described, getting too many buddy reads, and it just stressed me out. And I was just like, no, forget all this. I'm just gonna read whatever I want.
Yeah. My TBR, I started a TBR, I think, a couple months ago. And then I did another TBR a month later, and it was like mostly the same books. And then I realized this has just been a seasonal TBR, not a monthly TBR. That's okay. But I find that actually having a little bit of a TBR for me actually helps me not stress out so much about what to read next. It gives me a little bit of a peace of mind to have something in between. But at the same time, last year I noticed that I picked up a lot of books on whims. And every time I did that, most of the time, those books ended up being my favorite books of the year. So
wow,
there's something to be said about just picking up a book at the right time, just when you're in the mood for it.
Yeah, see, I like the excitement of like having nothing and then finishing a book, and then I get to just like search through and see what I'm in the mood for. Go in the Audible library and just do samples for a while until I find something that clicks.
Yeah. I don't know. There have been a couple of nights, especially with audiobooks, when I get into an audiobook zone where I'll finish an audiobook, and I listen to audiobooks actually with the sleep timer on to help me fall asleep. There have been a couple of nights though where I finished my audiobook and I've just stayed up scrolling for like half an hour, like, what is going to be my next audiobook? I don't know.
My
Yep.
new
I need to
thing.
do that sleep timer. I finished a lot of books while sleeping, so.
Oh, the sleep
Was it
timer is
epic? Was
amazing. I
it
love
dreamy?
it.
My new
Sleep
thing
timer is
is I just got Libby and access to my library, and now I'm trying to figure out, because my library sucks, how to get access to more libraries in my area, like Philadelphia. Because I'll just stay awake at night, go through Libby like I'm in the library, and people will throw. You threw the Conan author out. Like, I'll probably, after we're done, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to type in his name. I'm just going to not put on hold, but put it in my to be read lists in my app and things. And I just love to like go through my Kindle and it's like, oh, this is unlimited, download. This is on Kindle Unlimited, download. It's like I'm going to the library, right there in my bed while I'm about to go to sleep.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's good to have options, and we're definitely in the time of options. I know there was a time in my life when I think I fell out of reading fiction several times because I didn't have this huge, massive list that I have now of books to read. Like, I just had no idea at the time, like, what to read. I never have that problem anymore.
Yeah, there's too many.
It looks like some sci-fi is coming up here in the chat. Have you all read any sci-fi books that you enjoy? I know that
Yeah.
Baron, you love Dune, and any other stuff?
Big Dune fan. Last year I read Remembrance of Earth's Past. That series really blew me away. Haven't did a ton of sci-fi this year. I read Blind Sight, which was phenomenal. Difficult read, but worthwhile. I see some mentions of Hyperion. That's another series I'm a big fan of.
Yes, I own Hyperion, and I still need to get to it. It's
that's so good.
On my long-standing TBR.
Yeah, that's a great one.
But I've always been told that if you are going to read that, or at least Jonathan from Words and Time let me know that it's recommended to pick up the second book right after, or to read both the first and second book at least.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's preferred, but I don't think you have to. Because it's not so much like a plot story, you could say. There's some mystery that'll hang over, but it's like, it's like Canterbury Tales, so it's a lot of short stories all strung together. Yeah. What about you, Dan? You a sci-fi reader?
It's a new thing now for me. So, after reading Baker, here his name comes again. A lot of people gave descriptions that it was a lot like Dune. And growing up, I have a godfather who is a crazy sci-fi fan. I mean, you walk into his house and he's got books everywhere. And he goes to conventions and things like that. And, I was more a fantasy person. But then I decided to do Dune on audio, and I freaking loved it. I did it while I was working, and now I want to read it physically because, I feel like I've missed things here and there. But I really enjoyed the character work, the different cultures, the philosophical outlooks, and, I just thought it was an exceptional story. And I decided, before I did the Dune audio, because I liked fantasy and because I wanted to get into sci-fi, I got Empire of Silence. And from what I hear, that's kind of like combining the two right there. It's a very easy, segue into sci-fi. And Christopher Rocchio's writing is exceptional. Even though this book was a lot of setup, I thought it was just absolutely amazing. And I can't wait to finish that series and to continue on with Dune as well. As I mentioned Philip K. Dick. I've heard a lot of good things about him and his ideas and his storytelling. So I want to check him out. Asimov. All the regular names you hear out there, they're all, they've all been looked up and are in my Libby library right now.
I've read some Heinlein. I see that Heinlein's talked about in the chat. I read Starship Troopers and Stranger in a Strange Land so many years ago. I feel like I'm way overdue for rereading some of that. I also got into 2001 Space Odyssey. I read that. So I did, and of course, Ender's Game. So I have gone through a phase where I've read some sci-fi, and I'm always mad at myself because every time I read sci-fi, I love it. I usually love sci-fi. Dune is one of my favorite books of all time. I also adore Children of Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune. But for some reason, I just never make enough time for it. But I do want to get to Sun Eater. I have heard great things about Rocchio's prose, as you had said, Dan. And I have heard that, of course, it takes a lot of inspiration from Dune, but also Book of the New Sun, too, I think.
Yep. Yeah, it's a good one. I enjoyed it myself. You need to read Three Body Problem.
I was
Yes,
just going to
you
bring
told me
that
that.
up. The
I think you
theme sounds
recommended
so
that to
cool
me,
in
didn't
that.
you? Baron,
Yes.
you recommended that one specifically to me,
Yes.
right? Okay.
I'd be curious what your thoughts are on there.
Okay. I need to write that down. That and Lonesome Dove, like those are the two Baron, highly recommended Baron to Joanna recommendations there. So
Yep.
check that out. You've also made me really curious about Clive. Is it Clive Barker?
Mm-hmm.
The author that you like? Now, is he the one that wrote Thief of Always? That middle grade book? Or
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yes. So because you did a review of that book and I was all thrilled because I've actually read that book before, The Thief of Always, which is fantastic. I loved it. But I've never read any of his adult horror books. Oh no, somebody's mowing the lawn outside. Sorry if that's loud.
Yes. So he writes horror, but fantasy as well. So most of the ones that I'm a big fan of are more the dark fantasy ones.
Yeah. So which one would you recommend? Like Weave World? Is that the one?
Yeah, that's a good starting point. Yeah, definitely. It's a big book, but it's not like too overwhelming, and I think it's a good representation of his style. You know, pretty prose, very theatrical, kind of wild out there, some dark stuff, and it's very thematically rich. Most of his books are, and that's what I'm drawn to.
Yeah, it just sounds kind of like otherworldly. Is the impression I always get with Weave World.
It's very Dark Tower.
Ah, interesting. Yeah,
it's like the English version of Dark Tower, you could say.
The English version of Dark Tower. Now, is he the same horror writer? He's a horror writer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is he the one that wrote Pinhead?
Yeah, the Hellraiser stories. Yeah.
Whoa, yes, that takes me back. Did you ever see those movies, Dan? Do you remember those?
Oh yes, definitely. Pandora's Box for sure. Yeah, I've definitely watched all those movies back in the day, and they, back then that was kind of a unique story too.
It was scary back then.
These unique, more unique stories. Especially when it comes to horror.
Yep, and that's a novella he wrote called The Hellbound Heart. It was adapted. Fun fact: that the editor for that was George R.R. Martin.
What?
Yeah.
No way. It's crazy. Wow. Yay. Are you two, by the way, a Song of Ice and Fire fans? I can't remember.
Oh yeah, big time.
Yay!
Yeah, I would say that's what got me into reading.
No way! I didn't know that.
Yeah. After during my time in recovery, Game of Thrones was wrapping up, and when I was watching that, I was like, this was made for me. Actually, that was my first statement before I read Abercrombie. When I read Abercrombie, I was like, these books are made for me. When I watched A Game of Thrones, I'm like, this is the story that I need. This is what I love. This darker fantasy, this more realistic style of storytelling. And when it ended, I hadn't begun my reading journey. When Game of Thrones ended, I was just like, I'm going to go get the books now. And I read the books. And when I was done with that, I'm like, where do I go from here? And so I jumped into fantasy. Like I told you earlier, I looked up, best fantasy, Jordan and Sanderson and Rothfuss came up, and I read most of them. I only got into 3 books in the Wheel of Time, but I read the whole Mistborn series, and I was just craving something, that I could relate to more. And when Abercrombie came up, I read Abercrombie, and that's when the floodgates opened for me, and I just began to buy all dark fantasy books that I could find. I jumped into Mark Lawrence, and then I jumped into other things that were suggested, and Baker, and that's I would say Game of Thrones, after that ended, it is the reason why I just started to want to get into reading again, and find stories that just connected with me.
Oh, this makes me so happy. I love A Song of Ice and Fire, as you all know. About to start my reread of a Storm. Sorry, not A Storm of Swords. Dance with Dragons. I get their titles all screwed up in my head for some reason sometimes.
Oh, so you're near the end.
You're at the end.
Yeah, near the end of my reread. I'm so excited. It's been like such a wonderful journey. That's also been why this year has been unusual for me. I've probably done a lot more rereading this year than I have ever. But it's been so amazing, especially with those books, because I read those. I started that series around the time season 1 came out. I did read them all before the series really got going. And it was just unlike anything else I needed. I think that's what is so special to me about certain types of fantasy books. Like I was saying that earlier with something. I was saying that earlier with something about, Gardens of the Moon. How it seemed to fill a void for me that I didn't even know I had. Like it gave me something I didn't even realize I needed or wanted. That's exactly how I felt with The Song of Ice and Fire. That's exactly how I felt when I read Lord of the Rings the first time. That's exactly how I felt when I read the Farseer trilogy, even by Robin Hobb. There was just something there that I needed, that it gave me. So very special books for me. And just rereading them is making me appreciate them on a whole new level now that I know more about writing and fantasy, especially because I was so new to it at the time. So it was like the perfect gateway into adult fantasy for me.
Yeah, I need to reread them for sure. It's been many a year since I actually gone through it, but I've rewatched the show so many times that it almost feels like I have, So I need to put a little space in between before I pick the books up.
See, I haven't watched the show since it came out.
Really?
So so the show's not very fresh in my memory at all. I do remember it, but it's not very fresh in my memory at all. But it's
still the greatest show that I've ever seen.
Oh, I just think the books are
in my #1 show.
I think the show has incredible cast, an incredible cast, and I think that especially for the early seasons, they did an amazing job. I know that specifically I always say the battle at Blackwater Bay, that particular episode, which George R. R. Martin wrote, is phenomenal. I think it's actually even better than the books, in my opinion. That particular episode, for me personally, even though some things are left out, but as a whole, I love the book so much more. They don't even come close in my heart, not even close. And I do feel like the show was a lot. I mean, I'll find out because I still need to reread the 5th book, but I honestly think the show is a lot darker than the books are. Felt like the violence was a lot more amped up and more. I know I've talked here on the particular episode about enjoying darker toned stories, but honestly, this show felt a little too dark for me at times. I'll be honest. I think it just hits in a different way than reading it.
Yeah, well, that's what the viewers want, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, for sure.
More sex, violence, and swearing. The more you can pack in, the more viewers you're going to get.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I think we're coming up on, we're just past the 2-hour mark now, but I thought I would ask you really quickly, because I don't think I've ever asked you to. How did you find out about BookTube? And I think I'm just thinking of this question now because that's actually how I found out about BookTube. Because I had just finished watching the last season of Game of Thrones. and I was not happy with how the show wrapped up, like so many fans. So I wanted to find somebody who could talk about it, and I actually searched YouTube, found Daniel Green talking about it. Then I found out about BookTube from there. But I'd be curious from you two, how did you find out about BookTube?
For me, I remember kind of getting reintroduced into fantasy. I was at a dinner party at my parents' house. My dad had a copy of The Hobbit that I ended up borrowing. And then from there, immediately reread Lord of the Rings and was doing the online search for, hey, what are all the top series? And just started looking them up. And boom, I found all the big channels, like you mentioned, Daniels and Mike's, etc. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. And then here we are now talking.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just one small search and changes everything. What about you, Dan?
Yeah, that's kind of how it happened for me as well. You know, after the Game of Thrones series ended and I wanted to look for other, you know, fantasy authors and books that I wanted to read, you know, I typed in greatest fantasy books of all time and 100 greatest fantasy books, and Weeks and Sanderson and all those guys popped up. And, you know, when you type that in, you do get like a video that comes up, you know, in your search. Like, yeah, who's this guy? Daniel Green? And, you know, you clicked on that video and I'm like, oh, he's got, you know, man, he's got some enthusiasm. Good. I like that. And, you know, I started watching, you know, his was the first, and Captured in Words. And, you know, you start looking for your niche, you know, what you booktubers that align with your tastes. And, you know, I ran into all you guys, and the rest is absolutely history. My biggest mistake was like, you know, I could do what they do. And then I got out there and tried to do a book review. I'm like, man, this shit ain't easy. You really got to put your thought into it, you know? And then I'm like, I know I'm kind of funny. I can work with that, but like I really want to be able to review a book like an intellectual. So, you know, even though I started my channel and you know, just kept watching people, you know, review books, and I wanted to learn to do that better, so I just kept going on with it.
That's great. It is a process too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a skill set. It's a skill set. Fantastic. Well, this has been such a fun episode of Why Read. I've really enjoyed talking with you guys. It's kind of neat that we had a darker themed thing going on with darker books, McCarthy and Baker, Abercrombie. But yeah, if you guys want to tell our audience where to find you, feel free. Go ahead, and Baron, you first.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you, Joanna. Appreciate being on here. And my channel is Your Brain on Books. I do primarily book reviews of all sorts of different genres, so come check me out.
And my name is Dan. My channel name is TheBlack&BlueCollarReader. It's kind of a mouthful, but you'll figure it out after you say it a few times. Yeah, you can find me on here. Maybe starting a Discord soon with a couple other booktubers from 2023. You could probably find me on there. And I really don't do Twitter. I don't like that area. So, yeah, check me out on BookTube.
Wonderful.
Oh, on behalf of Joanna and I joined the Grimoire
Discord. Yes.
And
the link
Joanna,
to that.
thank you so much for inviting me. I remember when I first saw this segment of your Why Read, and I was just like, I want to be on that. And when you hit me up, I just was so grateful. So thank you.
Aw, thank you so much, Dan. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I really appreciate how personal you got with your story with addiction. I know it resonated with a lot of people. And Baron, you're just such an inspiration to me. I've always appreciated your taste in books, your thoughtfulness on why you read, and all your recommendations as well. So it's been so wonderful chatting with both of you. I will leave links to both channels in the description below. Also, my socials, as well as the Grimoire Discord, where you can find Baron and me if you want to chat more. And you could also watch the replay and leave a comment if you're watching this later. Thank you so much. It means a lot. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.